Welcome to Kepler Conversations. I'm Dr. Scott Postma. Kepler is an online marketplace for classical Christian education. We employ the historical university model so that we can leverage the best available technology and empower families by liberating teachers so they can make a classical liberal arts education available, accessible, and affordable. Well, in today's Kepler Conversation, I am joined by teacher Levi Gulliver. Levi was born in Orlando, Florida, and was homeschooled along with his six siblings. He began studying Latin all the way back in his grammar years and eventually paid his way through college by teaching and tutoring Latin. After he earned a Bachelor of Arts degree at Thomas Edison State University, he completed Circe Institute's apprenticeship program and the Tirocinium Latinum, which is an advanced Latin apprenticeship. And I hope I said that right. Since then, he's taught Latin online through Circe Online Academy, and he serves as the headmaster at King Alfred Classical School in Orlando. Welcome, Levi. Glad to have you.
Well, thank you very much, Scott. Thanks for having me.
Well, one of the things we love to do to get started is to learn a little bit about you. And so tell us about Levi Gulliver. Who are you outside of the classroom? What do you love to do besides teaching?
That's a good question. So like a lot of teachers, a lot of my hobbies are reading, etc. But things that aren't directly related to education that I absolutely love to do are Kempo karate, which is a great break, although it's the teacher in me still is trying to accidentally find analogies to how do you teach karate? Wait, what are the instructors doing? So so being in the dojo is a good opportunity to be a student for a change. I'm by no means an expert. And so getting to be the one who isn't clued in is it's a good way to build sympathy with students. That's for sure.
That sounds like a great way to do it. Well, the only martial art I practice is what I call sunduko, and that's collecting lots. It's a Japanese word that means collecting lots of books that you intend to read, but they pile up. So anyway, you said you love to read as well, and then martial arts. What a fun combination of things. So tell us a little bit about your own schooling. Now, we heard in the bio you were homeschooled and then went on to college and apprenticeship program and actually paid your way through college by teaching Latin. Can you talk a little bit about how you came to classical education and what that was like for you?
Yeah, so I had the great fortune, I think, to be homeschooled, especially a couple decades ago when homeschooling was known, but far less common than it is today. And I was, I think, exposed to things called classical education around the time of middle school through organizations that are still around today, like Classical Conversations and others. But as a interested person, I think right around the time I was graduating high school, and starting to, just as a sort of high school senior, junior job, tutor students on the side, I realized how profoundly helpful all the resources created by the classical education sphere were to me just in this sort of side job as I was a graduating senior from high school, that when I had questions about how do I teach, what is this thing all about, I found so much help from places like the Circe Institute, but also all the different organizations around sort of the classical Christian renewal. And then as I got into undergrad, I was able to keep up a lot of teaching. I actually taught really as much as I went to undergrad class, so to speak. I had the chance to do a lot of credits by exam through Thomas Edison State University. So some people will be familiar with the sort of subculture of people who kind of hack their way through an undergrad by taking credits by exam. And for a variety of reasons, that was actually a really good option for me. And it's quite an affordable option. And so I had the great benefit of, in just a couple years, working through that degree program, taking some online classes and a lot of credits by exam and funding the whole thing through teaching. So I like to say I got the certification and the degree and managed to do it without taking too much uh, student debt, which was such a huge blessing starting out. But that time really pushed me into, how do you teach? It became a practical question, and then I had to find the answers in classical Christian ed, frankly, because I didn't find good answers elsewhere.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things you just mentioned here it puts a little bit of a spin on our kind of intended conversation. So I don't want to put you too much on the spot, but you've said a couple very interesting things that I think you could probably help our audience with a little bit. And you mentioned that clepping or testing your way out of courses isn't always the best option for everybody, but it also speaks in some ways to your homeschool education, right? It speaks to the education you had in what some people would perceive as an informal or alt ed pursuit of education. So we live in a culture, just to kind of frame this a little bit in more clear terms, we live in a culture that really incentivizes institutional learning and de-incentivizes just demonstrable learning, right? And so it does say something then about something you said about your martial arts. What is this thing of teaching, right? So what is teaching and what is learning? So I kind of framed it that way so that I could ask you this question. Can you talk a little bit about what is teaching and what does that mean to teach and what does it mean to learn? How are these two things different and how should we approach them?
Yeah, it is a fantastic question, and it's by no means a question that one can give a simple answer that's comprehensive to. But I more and more have, I think, from a practical level, started to think about teaching as discipleship. And obviously, thinking about Latin here, disciple really just means teach, right? Teach, educate. So, but when we think of discipleship, the helpful image that comes to our mind is a personal relationship.
Mhm.
And even through an online space, a relationship that is person to person, that is that is not just me sitting alone with a book, but somebody dynamically leading me somewhere, seeing where I am and helping me to become a better person, is the kind of essence, I think, of teaching and learning. And that to me is the interesting, just personally, part of education. The education sphere is so interesting to me because it's a little almost, and others have said this, miracle when people uh, become a more skilled version of themselves or a more understanding version of themselves, right? Like every little epiphany is so fun to see, and to be able to be the person who doesn't cause those epiphanies but brings people to the place where they can make those discoveries themselves, where they can just be in the right moment to let reality make itself evident to them, is it's just a fun process to be around.
Well, what you're describing sounds a lot like that, what Socrates called that midwifery, right? That
Yeah.
you're helping deliver that. And what a human interaction, that teaching and learning and discipleship really is. I
Mhm.
heard Josh Gibbs, I think, or he wrote something, or I heard him say it recently about, an AI
Mm.
chat bot or whatever a learning model or language model may know Dante or may be able to spew out information about Dante more than perhaps some young, humanities teacher might be able to, but it can't teach kids to love, literature or Dante, right? And so somebody could pick up a Wheelock's Latin, book or text or Henley or something, and just learn by rote memory the grammar, but they're not going to have that human interaction that they get with an instructor who loves the language,
Mhm.
loves the nuances, and loves investing in the student and drawing that out of them.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely, right. In a certain sense, this education is one of the few industries that just categorically can't be disrupted too much by AI.
Right.
Where's
Uh,
that theory?
well, as much as they want to say this is going to be the new wave of the future, it can't replace that
Mhm,
human interaction that a teacher does, a live teacher. And
mhm,
I'm really thankful for some of the online platforms or the technology that we have today that allows us to have that kind of face to face interaction. That I took an online, not an online, a distance learning course. This is way back in the '80s, college course. When it shows my age, but and it was mailing in, you're just going through envelope system, mailing in stuff that you're writing, and there was no real engagement with the person. So this is really helpful.
Mhm.
So you've been teaching with Circe Online Academy for some years, and then, as most of our audience knows, there was a jointure. We call it a jointure with Circe and Kepler, bringing the online platform, teaching platform, onto the Kepler platform, and so naturally, that's what brought you here. Um, in that, I guess, technical context. But what brought you to the online teaching sphere in terms of delivery and reaching families, just as a whole, and the particular courses we'll talk about here in a second that you're actually teaching?
Mhm. That's a good question. First, I should just say that I'm not sure how much of a neologism it is, but the term jointure has just brought me a lot of delight over the past number of months. Every time I get to hear it. But the online space, particularly for the courses I teach, Latin courses, are the space is so critical for a number of my students I've had over the years who don't have access to quality Latin instruction in person locally. And even if you have a relatively large metro area, you may not have, if you are not a 5-day school kind of family, you may not have a good option. So they're vanishingly few. And then for rural students or students in other countries outside the US, it might be even less possible. Um, that said, I have a real desire for Latin to be a continued option for students for languages. I think as much ink and breath has been spilled and used to declare Latin is something that we in the developed sort of like Western tradition really need to keep a hold of.
Mm.
I'm a fan of people learning all kinds of languages. Um, no shame for anybody trying to learn a modern language. I think that's a great use of time. But it's also a great use of time to learn a so-called dead language. And if that kind of thing is going to be broadly available, then the online space in today's world is the place where it has to be. It just, uh, for at least a few generations, is not going to be available to people in person.
It'll be a great day when when it's so readily available, right? That you can turn a corner and meet a Latin tutor. Well,
Yeah.
you use that term "dead language." I hear people say that all the time: living language, dead language,
Mhm.
and the idea of Latin I like to use, and this is not a corrective at all. It's just more of an
Mhm.
observation. To say
Mhm.
is I like static and dynamic, because
Mhm.
Latin I think is important. Just like you said, modern languages are just as important, and we should learn those, but that's part of our inheritance, right? It's part of the heritage of our own learning, our own culture, our own language. And so not to learn Latin or Greek, or at least have some working knowledge of these, really in some ways is a diminishment of our humanizing, within our particular Western context. And so I really appreciate folks like you who are bringing this static language that we've inherited as part of our own, into the forefront, that we're revisiting it. I mean, there was a time when you think about C.S. Lewis, growing up in his generation, that everybody, that's just standard. You didn't get into college if you couldn't pass Latin or Greek exams, right?
Right. Yeah, and there's a good loose analogy, I think, between a lot of students today might not be able to readily read cursive, especially certain styles of cursive. And so you can imagine a student receiving a bunch of letters from a grand or great grandparent and not being able to read them, right? So
Yeah.
wouldn't you take the time if you had these letters that were so important to your personal history to put in the effort to learn to read cursive, right? So that you could read these letters because they're not merely letters that somebody somewhere wrote, but the things that have deep implications for you. And that's what the Latin written, the tradition of things written in Latin is for us. I mean, it's well over 2 millennia of things that are not just formative, but almost comprehensive in their influence culturally for just about everybody listening to this.
I love that analogy. I discovered just a few years ago, I guess I made some really wild assumptions. And it's one of those embarrassing things that I just kind of, I don't know where I came up with the assumption, that most everything that was written in Latin we have available in English today. And you find out there is so much there that has not yet been translated. That was, that's the operational language of the intellectual world for, like you said, 2 millennia is written in Latin. So what an access to that, to our great grandparents, by taking the time to learn that.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think it's the Davenant Institute estimates something like 95% of, just talking about Reformation era sort of Latin books, are still untranslated.
Wow.
And then of those that are translated, there might be one translation, right? The great majority have only one translation, and we all know that one translation is apt to miss things. So
yeah.
So we've vanishingly now, maybe the things that have survived that are in multiple translations are some of the best of the best. But if we have any idea that we're, accurately able to access it all without speaking and understanding, or being able to read and understand the language, no, not even close.
That's huge. That is huge. Well, you're teaching a very interesting course this fall, and it's for two reasons. First of all, it's in Latin reading, obviously, but Aesop's fables, and so here we have the Greek fables in Latin, coming to us, through these languages. Can you talk about this course, because it's fascinating to me? I say this just on a personal level. I just went through last year with my grandkids. We met online and read through Aesop's fables, and having conversations about them. So it's kind of near and dear to my heart. But yeah, I'd love to hear about it.
Yeah, the Aesop fable tradition is wonderful. I think it's sort of even more wonderful because Aesop himself is a somewhat shadowy figure in the history. I'm not an expert in it, but have been, even in antiquity, numerous versions and renditions of the fables, right? So it really is it's a tradition in the fullest sense of the word. Each century produces almost a new rendition, I think is the word, of the fables, right down through the Middle Ages to the modern day. And yeah, I love Aesop's fables. I think how many there are is provides such a rich storytelling tradition. The other great thing about Aesop's fables is they're short. I'm a fan of, I hear it attributed to one of the librarians of Alexandria, the quotation, what is it? Big book, big bore.
Yeah.
Nothing against Homer. I'm teaching Homer this coming year, but Aesop's fables are delightfully brief. And what I'm doing in this course is retelling in Latin Aesop's fables, although they've been told dozens of times in Latin already, in my own version, in a very simplified, highly illustrated, mostly with photographs, since they're animals, are the principal characters, way, so that students can, in just half an hour, 45 minutes, understand a fable in Latin. And the idea for the course is that whether it's a complement or supplement to a more grammatical course, that the real meat of coming to Latin as an intelligible language has to be, or maybe even a better part to the analogy, the real bones of that have to be stories and texts that have meaning. In other words, you're never going to get all the way to where we want in Latin, which is, in my opinion, to be able to engage with the texts if we don't start engaging the texts.
Yeah.
And so Aesop's fables are a great place to start. They, like I said, they're delightful. They're also, of course, very moral. And so we usually in English will get into a few minutes of debate sometimes, even about, wait, what is the moral? Because I'm a strong believer in not giving students the moral, since most of the time they can work it out themselves. And I think they're they're a uniquely apt storytelling mode for middle school, I think. Some middle schoolers will feel themselves somewhat above them, but I think they all really enjoy it.
I love the fact that you're teaching this course on a number of levels that you just mentioned here. So first we have, these are stories that have come down to us, for I mean, forever. I mean, we've got at least 2,000 years of these stories being told. They've been shaping our imagination, in many ways, much like Jesus's parables. I mean, these are just fabulous stories in and of themselves. Secondly, you're engaging these moral, conditions that we have to think about. So the moral imagination is being formed, and then learning to think in Latin. I'm not a Latin teacher or scholar, but I've been around a little bit enough to understand that we learn best by learning the same way we learn our native language, right? By engaging the stories and the as much immersion as we can, within limits, but that immersive sort of way of engaging the stories, thinking about it, and then the grammar kind of comes along just like it did for our own native language. But please feel free to correct me if I had that wrong. But as I'm hearing you and listening unpack, that fascinates me on each of those levels.
Yeah, I think that that last thing you brought out is really key, and that's somewhat different from a lot of Latin instruction that goes on. While of course you can learn Latin a number of different ways, I think it's much more, and this is also true of your conversation with a colleague of mine, Jeremy Wagner, that he, I think, made the point that it's more fun, right? And so therefore you can make more progress when you're reading things that are interesting, and when the work you're doing also has immediate sort of reward. Although there are things that are sort of a drudge about learning a language, the majority of learning a language should be pretty interesting, right? By the time you become fluent in Spanish, you'll have engaged a lot of interesting Spanish content. And we want to imitate that in Latin. We don't want to pretend that we can immerse people in, Hispanic culture in the same way we could if you moved to Madrid. You can't do that with Latin, obviously. So it does look a bit different, but we should definitely think about how can we get students into an environment like this class is, like this course, where they're hearing a lot of Latin, where they're seeing things that are connected to Latin words, Latin sentences, and Latin phrases, so that all of those things take on meaning. And then when they come to a text like the Aeneid or like the Vulgate, those same words and phrases now have meaning, right? As Latin, not merely, as Lewis pointed out brilliantly in his autobiography, meaning through English. It has that direct kind of meaning.
Yeah, I love that. That's such a great analogy, or great illustration by what Lewis was saying there. So as we're kind of winding down our time here, this is so fascinating. I would love to I'd love to talk more about it, but maybe give us just a nugget, something to kind of whet the appetite, just a little peek into the class, if you wouldn't mind, or some little truth or something that would be encouraging for people to get to know it better.
Yeah. So you mentioned Josh Gibbs earlier, and he's a great proponent of something he calls class catechisms, which is the question and response sort of format of what many people will call memory work, or what used to be called in like Anne of Green Gables day, saying your lessons. So we do that, and we have a couple pieces of memory work, usually a psalm, some Latin sayings that we recite at the beginning of each class together. And so the students become very familiar with these pieces. And recently, a student of mine in high school, these are the classes I teach at in person here in Orlando, she came to class one day and said, "Mr. Gulliver, I heard our pieces from our class catechism. I heard the selection of Virgil." And I said, "What do you mean you heard the selection of Virgil?" Well, she heard it in, if I'm not mistaken, the Gladiator sequel. I've not seen it.
Okay.
But apparently it was that exact quotation that they used in the film. And she said, "I don't think it was used that well in the movie." So what I love about that is that it's a little bit silly because a blockbuster film, but it just shows that even our popular culture today hasn't managed to totally break free from the tradition, right? So um, it's a delightful thing that really opens up so much of not just historical culture and the heritage as we were talking about before, but it breaks open pop culture today.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, everything that you have said has made me love this class even more. Just talking to you and talking about these things, and I'm personally a proponent of the catechism. And it's something I learned from Josh Gibbs a few years ago. I heard him talk about it,
Mhm.
employed it in some of my classes, and wow, it was a game changer. And the kids loved it. I mean, it was like you said earlier. Delight is something Horace talks about that. That
Mhm.
gives us the opportunity to be enlightened. We can't really be enlightened if we're not being delighted. Otherwise it's a little bit harder. But well, Levi, I have really appreciated you taking the time to talk with me and talk through some of these things. And all of the courses and learn more about Levi um, will be in the show notes. So our audience, you can find all of those things and access his courses or contact him if you have questions. Once again, Levi, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much, Scott.
All right. God bless you all. Bye bye.
You have a good one.